Happy to have you back. And for our newcomers, we're excited to have you here with us for the first time today. In this episode, we're going to dive into accountability versus psychological safety, as today's leaders are navigating finding the right balance between focusing on performance and people in their organizations. Now, as I quickly share some housekeeping notes, drop in the chat or on the comments and social where you're joining in from today. We are recording today's session, so if you're interested in a replay, be on the lookout for an email later today. That email is also going to include a survey for feedback, as well as a number of resources that are aligned to today's conversation. And we suggest putting your phone on Do Not Disturb, quitting out of your email and messaging apps so you can really get the most out of today's discussion. And it's also going to help with your audio and video quality. And we love interaction, so feel free to share your thoughts and comments in the chat throughout the show. Now, to get this hour underway, I'm going to introduce our speakers for today. Our special guest is the Novartis Professor of Leadership and Management at the Harvard Business School. She's been recognized by the biannual Thinkers 50 Global Ranking of Management Thinkers since 2011 and was ranked #1 multiple years, most recently in 2023. She studies teaming, psychological safety, and organizational learning, and her articles have been published in numerous academic and management outlets, including Administrative Science Quarterly, Academy of Management Journal, Harvard Business Review, and California Management Review. Her most recent book, The Fearless Organization: Creating Psychological Safety in the Workplace for Learning, Innovation, and Growth, offers a practical guide for organizations serious about success in the modern economy and has been translated into 15 languages. It was also selected for the Financial Times and Schroeder's Best Business Book of the Year award. Please join me in welcoming Novartis Professor of Leadership and Management at the Harvard Business School, Dr. Amy Edmondson. Dr. Edmondson, it's great to have you back with us, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Shelby. It's great to be with you.
Wonderful. And joining her is no stranger, an Aussie-turned New Yorker who coined the term neuroleadership when he co-founded NLI over 2 decades ago. With a professional doctorate, 4 successful books under his name, and a multitude of bylines ranging from the Harvard Business Review to the New York Times and many more, a warm welcome to the co-founder and CEO of the Neuroleadership Institute, Dr. David Rock. Great to have you back, David, and I'm passing it over to you.
Thank you, Shelby. Thank you very much. Actually, I was just in Australia, where I'm from originally, and they all say I have an accent now. Lovely being down there in summer. Amy, it's so great to chat with you again, and I'm actually really excited to dig into this conversation because I think there's a lot of insights for all of us, myself included, in this topic. And we actually had a record number of registrations for this, so clearly it's on people's minds. And I guess there's this sort of thing in the zeitgeist where companies almost had to be really kind and thoughtful and much more considerate of people and their needs, right, than ever, through the pandemic and even sort of since. There was this feeling like, we had to care, we had to have more empathy. And I think there's a lot of CEOs at this point, and just leaders generally, saying, oh, enough of that. It's time we get back to business, right? Let's focus on accountability. And I think in some ways, kind of psychological safety has been bucketed as kind of, in the kindness category and not the actually let's really, get down to work category. And which I think is kind of a bad rap and an incorrect rap in a way. But any comments on that? Sort of you seeing that in the zeitgeist?
I completely agree that has been a sort of a misconception, a misunderstanding that worry or that trend is taking shape in terms of, okay, enough of the support, enough of the kindness, now let's get back to business. I think it's a misnomer in so many ways, and not the least of which is a sort of misunderstanding of what psychological safety really means. And I understand that the term itself contributes to some of the confusion, but let me just define it quickly. I'll define psychological safety, as I always have, as a belief that the consequences of speaking up with, and I always had parenthetically, but I don't think it needs this, with work-relevant content, ideas, questions, concerns, and even mistakes will not be punitive. The consequences won't be punitive. So what that really means is I can actually do my job without fear of humiliation or shame. It does not mean freedom to not do my job, right? It means that, in fact, the very behaviors I need to engage in to do my job well, especially as a team member with others, feel possible, that they feel acceptable.
Yeah, interesting. So let's make this tangible. give me a story. It could be from your life or something you've seen where like psychological safety is in a team and maybe where it isn't. So we can sort of compare and contrast and get the picture in our mind.
Sure. Well, let me start. I think it's easier to start with where it isn't, and I'll give you two operating room teams. And in the first one, and this is one that I studied, one of 16 cardiac surgery teams I studied a few years back, that they were willing to be studied because they were doing something new. They were all trying to implement something called minimally invasive cardiac surgery, where instead of the traditional procedure of opening up the sternum, they were doing the procedure, the repair through a small incision in the patient's chest. And to do that meant that without the visual access to that a surgeon normally has, the surgeons had to rely on other team members, nurses, anesthesiologists, and various other roles to speak up and speak up quickly, often to say, stop what you're doing, because the internal clamp that can only be seen through fluoroscopy images has moved its location. Now, in one team that I studied, I talked to one of the nurses, and she said, I just can't do it, right? It would feel impossible. I might whisper it to the fellow, which is sort of a lower level physician in training, versus saying, like, to say directly to the surgeon, stop, the clamp has shifted, it just feels impossible. Now, I promise you, I studied many other teams in the same exact study, in the same exact context, where they said, of course I'd speak up. And it's easy because it's expected. The procedure needs us to do that, or you can't have a good procedure.
Right.
And just to not have just two identical contrasts, I had the chance to learn about an operating room team recently where an anesthesiologist told me a story of where a nurse corrected him and pointed out his error, and he thanked her for pointing out the error. That's a psychologically safe team. That's a team where that patient was getting better care.
Yeah, interesting. As I'm picturing that, I'm imagining an operating room, and if you've got a team of, say, 6 people around the surgeon, they actually have different needs for psychological safety in a way, right? So psychological safety is not like the surgeon does one thing and then everyone feels safe. They walk in and smile and everyone magically feels like they can speak up, right?
No.
How handsome they are. It's like one person needs a huge amount of encouragement to just make sure that they speak up, and someone else, it might just be natural and second nature, and you almost got to tell them to talk less. We've been thinking about maybe there's sort of a sweet spot of psychological safety, and people aren't second guessing everything, but they're also not quiet. There's sort of have you thought about that at all?
Well, yes, I have, but I don't see it as a sweet spot for psychological safety. Because I actually don't think fear, which is the opposite of psychological safety, is ever a great motivator, or at least fear of each other. Fear of the deadline, fear of losing the patient, all of that can be a good motivator. But if I'm afraid of you, David, then I'm doing too much cognitive work to figure out what's acceptable to say, what isn't. So when people are sort of are in the habit of sharing too much, this isn't a psychological safety problem. This is a discipline problem, or this is a feedback problem. Or they need and deserve our help to learn what's helpful to their colleagues and what is less helpful. Because I think all of us want to be effective.
Yeah.
So it's not about, let's make it just safe enough that we only get the right amount of information. It's more like, let's make it safe, and then let's make sure you get feedback to know how effective you're being.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. We had someone on the show a few months back who I don't think you've met yet, a fascinating gentleman. And he's developed a black box recorder like they have in airplanes, but for operating rooms, literally. And they're collecting 1 million data points a day and analyzing it with AR. And every site they've put this in, they have about 20 sites so far. Every site is saving quite a few lives a year, as well as all these other cost savings, these other things. And we maybe my team can put the link to the webinar with him in the chat so folks can listen. It was amazing. Dr. Theodore Grantcharov, and he's been doing it for 20 years, and it's finally taking off because AI is kind of caught up. But the cliff note of it, and it's in this podcast, the cliff note is that it's sort of easy to collect the data, easy-ish now to collect the data. It's a lot harder to find the insights, but the really hard thing was to create change in
Right.
human practices, of course. And that's where the sort of, where the traffic stopped. But then I asked him, what are the big insights in that middle step? What are the most important insights you've got from the data, right? You've looked at all the data. He said, well, accidents happen. Firstly, when people are distracted, so someone comes in with a birthday cake, right? But secondly, the second, like a really big category, and I think he said this was the biggest category, is actually just people are too quiet. He said
Wow.
the most dangerous operating room is a quiet operating room.
Wow. Wow.
And he's got that from the data. We're
Oh,
working with him to kind of tell that
that's
story. So
fascinating.
it's really it's really out there. So we were thinking, oh, is there
Yeah.
too much speaking? Is there not, like where is that sort of,
Well, one of the things that we found, and to our surprise with the cardiac surgery study, was because we expected high quality after action reviews to be a differentiator across teams. And it just didn't show up as a variable that mattered to performance. But what did, we realized it wasn't after action, it was sort of in action.
Right.
The teams that were sort of talking, okay, now I'm doing this and I'm thinking that, and what they were thinking aloud with each other so
Right.
that everybody could stay fully engaged and on track. And the ones that, kind of did this thinking in action were in fact more effective versus
Yeah.
after action.
Yeah, no, we've studied this whole thing like from a couple of different angles over the years. We studied like the way that diverse and inclusive teams actually outperform and have this higher IQ. And it turns out there's an actual mechanism called cognitive elaboration that's occurring, which is literally people are explaining themselves more richly, right? And challenging each other more, but also like they're literally working harder to communicate. And communicating more fully, more accurately, but also challenging each other more fully, more accurately. So everyone's going like a couple of clicks in as opposed to being surface,
right,
in a more diverse and inclusive team. And that's where you get the results. And that's sort of how I'm picturing this as well.
Yes, and it reminds me of the ladder of inference, right? Instead of just sort of, well, I think this and I think that, it's wait, let's elaborate. Let me walk you through my thinking. Let me tell you some of the evidence or examples I'm thinking of that lead me to this conclusion. And then I'm hoping and asking you to do the same.
Yeah. Well, let's dig in a little more to psych safety. So, you've been studying this for a while. I think, we've got a definition now. It's people feeling like there aren't consequences to, to speaking up, that it's important that they do. So, you've been working for a while, as we've been working on this with you for the last year or so to take this out to, large audiences. One of the things, the insights we've had is that it seems to be a very high order skill. Like it's not like generally being more thoughtful. It's not like inclusion, which is kind of more active. Inclusion is still active. It's like even further than that. Can you describe the kind of 3 sets of habits that you came to?
Yes, and it's, it might be worth just my adding to the prior definition that, because here, I think this ties so nicely into your original question. Psychological safety does not refer to a state of comfort, maybe a state of engagement, but it's because I think learning and leaning in are inherently uncomfortable. And so it's really about we're trying to create the state where people know that they're going to be uncomfortable sometimes, but in service of the goal, right? In service of the purpose. So how do you get that, right? How do you create that kind of expectation and engagement? And I had come up with, and then with you and your team, we had sort of elaborated on some of this from a neuroscience perspective. But the 3 behavioral categories are setting the stage, inviting participation, actively, and responding thoughtfully. And setting the stage is about getting people on the same page about what it is we're trying to do here, provide high quality care to this patient, or, design a exciting new product, whatever it is, getting aligned on the same page around the nature of the goal. And by the way, why it's challenging and why it needs us, and setting the stage so that people expect failure. They expect setbacks, they expect everything is not going to just go perfectly like a carpet rolling out with the force of inertia, right? There's going to be things that go well and things that don't go well, and set that out in advance. Encourage debate, but more than just saying, "Gee, I want to hear from you," you've got to You've got to invite it in actively.
Right,
Do what
right.
you're doing right now, which is asking questions. And when you ask questions and model a genuine interest in those questions, and then of course when you respond in a thoughtful way to whatever it is that people bring forward, it doesn't mean you have to agree with everything. God, no. It doesn't mean you have to like everything. It means you have to listen and respond. And if the response is a kind of a gentle redirect or even a forceful redirect, that's okay. That's still a productive
Yeah.
response.
Yeah, I know we had a lot of fun working with you last year with our whole research team, looking at like what are the very actionable habits that live underneath these. Like if you're going to focus on three things inside
Right.
set the stage, what would matter most, right? And same with invite participation, respond thoughtfully. And we developed a framework, a 3x3 for how to build this, and that's now gone out to a good number of people, and it's starting to really scale. But so we've got a definition of psych safety, right? We know it's a pretty advanced skill. Like I would say it is creating the conditions for safe arguing, like people debate, but then they still are friends at the end of the day. It's something like that, right? But let's change gears. What about accountability? So how do you define accountability from your perspective? And I'll share mine as well. How do you define it?
Great. Well, I define it as psychological ownership, like a genuine internal commitment to doing everything you can to achieve the goal or to do a good job, to uphold standards of excellence. And I think it can include a confidence that others also care, right? So that there's a shared sense of accountability. And because of that, a desire not to let them go. So a short way to say it is an internal commitment and ownership to doing what I need to do to contribute.
Yeah, interesting. I think it has some elements. Like one is you really care, right? But out of care comes attention, right? So sometimes I'll get on an airplane and I'll have a lot of work to do, and I'll open my laptop up straight away, and I'll be working away before we take off to get some things out, and then they'll bring like the towel around, so and I'll really watch if the person's actually conscious, the attendant, the flight attendant, if they're really conscious, because they might literally half the time they just give me a soaking wet towel that just destroys my computer and wrecks my month, right? And then you can tell they're caring. They're like, oh, they're checking. If you get on like Singapore Airlines or Emirates or something, they're like testing it, like making sure it's not too wet, and then they're like, okay, let's give it. But sometimes we get in a flight and I just get this, incredibly hot, like scalding hot, soaking wet. It's like, so I think it's like, part of it,
ownership,
caring.
ownership of the task, right? This is a totally mundane, routine task, or no, this is actually a moment, right? A moment of serving the passenger who's going to have a long flight ahead, or whatever it is, right? It's a completely different internal state that then manifests itself in a very different way.
Yeah. So I think an element of it is like really caring. You can call that responsibility. You can call that, all sorts of things. So I really like your definition of sort of about psychological ownership. And I think what it looks like is someone is really caring, and as a result of that, they're really paying attention, like in the moment, like almost a mindful way. They're like their attention is on the task, right, or the project over time, but they're giving it the appropriate amount of attention. Yeah, I think another element of this, and we've been thinking about this, is the amount of mentalizing that someone does about the activity, right? So this experience, like you give someone a project, and you don't think through kind of all the ways that could go wrong and all the things that could happen, and of course something goes wrong, right? Or other times you'll give someone a project and you'll be like, what, I wonder where things, I wonder how this could go wrong. Like you're giving someone a simple task, and it's like, get this back by 5 o'clock Friday. You're like, oh, hang on, we're in different time zones. 5 o'clock Friday, where? And hang on, how do I need it?
Mindfulness.
It's mindfulness. It's sort of mentalizing, and it's mentalizing on a couple of axes. One is over time, like what could go wrong over time? What could go wrong over space? What could go wrong as this person tries to do this? And so you're actually thinking about, as the person giving a task, you're actually thinking about increasing the chances that this person can actually get this right, and that the task is actually complete. So you care about almost all the obstacles that could happen, and you help that person plan ahead. So I just think of it as kind of going several clicks into imagining the task happening,
Right.
which is a mentalizing thing. So you're picturing the task happening, and you're sort of planning ahead for obstacles and kind of imagining what could go wrong. And that
Yes.
there's a lot of that in accountability. What's your reaction to that?
Yes, I mean, it is. I love this. And it's a kind of systems thinking, because you're not, I mean, I think we are spontaneously in the here and now and in our own heads and our own self, what I need, what I want, what I'm interested in. And to just pause long enough to think through, okay, what's it like from your perspective? And then also later, what's likely to happen next? Let's think a few steps ahead. That is a kind of systems thinking that I think leads to better interactions and ultimately to better quality work.
Right. Yeah, no, it's interesting. And then there's an element of accountability, I think, that kind of gets to growth mindset as well. There's an element of accountability, which is that, like, we do make mistakes, recognizing that mistakes do happen, right? And taking ownership for those and working out what you can learn. And so there's this element of like being willing to constantly improve, and you're not trying to prove that you're smart. So you've got this kind of situational humility, which is right back to psych safety in a way. It's one of the habits in psych safety. But to be accountable, you've got to be continuously learning in a way. And I think growth mindset and psych safety in some ways are similar, but even growth mindset and accountability have these really interesting connections, because there's maybe there's almost two types of accountability. There's punitive accountability, where you sort of everything's about hit the target or be punished, or there's growth oriented accountability, where you have an opportunity to grow and learn. But that's sort of how we're seeing it. What are your thoughts?
Well, one of the things, I mean, the word accountability in many organizational contexts is a kind of a bad word, right? It's a word about punishment, right? When people say, "Oh, you got to be held accountable," what they're meaning often is there will be negative consequences. And I think that's a shame, because we're operating in a volatile, uncertain, complex world. And in such a world, or in such markets, or in such organizations, it is a given that things will go wrong, right? Some things will go wrong. There will be setbacks, there will be failures. And so when people have that notion of accountability as punishment, then their natural and even smart strategy is to hide the truth, because the truth doesn't set you free. The truth ends up, giving you harm. And so that notion of accountability absolutely needs to be reframed and reworked and recommunicated, so that people understand that accountability is this kind of empowering sense of ownership, right? It's restoring the dignity to the individuals to want to own their part in a larger complex system.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, we think there's something to this, because often when companies talk about accountability, what they mean is, people are going to get fired when they don't hit their, targets faster, right?
Yeah, and if there's going to be accountability, if there's going to be negative consequences, and I understand there sometimes have to be, they ought to be based on process and strategy. How did you think about that? How did you execute on that? Not just on results, because in an uncertain world, there will be times where you did a magnificent job. You worked really hard. It was a good strategy, and it failed because of reality. And if those kinds of failures, which I call intelligent failures more often than not, are punished, all you really will accomplish is a lack of risk-taking and a lack of innovation, and that doesn't serve any organization.
Yeah. It's interesting. So I see two types of companies, broadly speaking, that kind of call us. One is a company that says, look, we've been really, really kind of driving a strategy, and maybe they're in the energy business, and they've had the same business for 100 years, literally, distributing power, and now Tesla's come along changing everything. We actually need to get everyone to innovate, so we need everyone to take more responsibility. We need people to be sort of more creative. We want to be kinder to everyone to facilitate that, less punitive. So that's one thing, right? So they're sort of like, they're trying to be kinder. Then there's another kind of organization where they're like, look, this is like a family. There's no accountability, right? Everyone's just, nice to each other. There's no, and so sometimes they'll be like, what they mean by accountability is people need to be fired if they're not achieving their targets within 3 months or 6 at the most, not never, or 3 years. And I think that's a kind of different kind of accountability in a way. It almost needs a different word. But I think that's a lot of what certainly leaders say when they talk about accountability. They're like, there has to be consequences. Maybe consequences is a better word. Any thoughts on that?
Well, there's always consequences in life, whether they're delayed or immediate. And the goal is to have the consequences be such that you get the behaviors you want, not the behaviors you don't want, right? So there's so many perverse effects where the consequences, say, of acknowledging a shortcoming, on not meeting the targets, will end up punitive, when in fact it was through no fault of your own. And what that will lead to is sandbagging, right? That will lead to just setting the targets lower next time, when you actually want people to be stretching. So you really have to be extraordinarily thoughtful about the likely outcomes of the things you reward and the things that you punish.
Right. Yes. I was working with a company recently, like, they had this challenge. They actually had done an incredible job of innovating across the pandemic. They'd completely changed their business model. They're doing something that had never been done before. They're being massively punished by the market because, like, they had lost a huge client. It was no fault of their own. It was like a government regulator came in and messed up their whole market. And like, they're really, really struggling. And right when they need to innovate, they just feel like they're being punished the whole time. Like, the market's like trying to make them accountable for failing. They're actually not failing. Their stock isn't doing great, but they're actually really, really succeeding on another level. So it's really complicated, this whole issue of sort of consequences and share price and all this. But let's put that type of accountability aside. Let's think about, like, growth-oriented accountability in a team. Let's sort of bring it to the team level. In growth-oriented accountability in a team, like, do you think it's possible for a team to kind of have, like, psychological safety but not have this accountability? Like, do you think it's possible to do that? Are they talk to me about that?
Yes, I mean, so I think, I mean, they may not be perfectly orthogonal, but I do think of psychological safety and accountability as two dimensions, right? Where both matter, right? You want people to have that sense of ownership and commitment, genuine commitment, to doing a good job, to using good strategies, and you want people to feel that they have permission for candor. If both are low, I call that the apathy zone, right? This is sort of where, not much going on around here, and you quit and stay, right? And sure, if you have just that sense of, I can say what I'm thinking, my colleagues and my manager don't humiliate me in any way, shape, or form, but I'm not terribly motivated, I'm not terribly bought in or accountable, I call that the comfort zone. And we know what that looks like. And I'm not saying that certain parts of your life shouldn't be the comfort zone, but most of the time work is work, and it's going to be better. It's not going to be the optimal place for your team to be. And sure, if you had just a really sense of high commitment, internal or external, to doing a great job, but you feel afraid, like that nurse in that operating room, afraid to point out when you see something, factually see something that could alter the health of the patient, and you just can't speak it because last time you spoke up and you were maybe wrong about something, you got your head bit off, right? So that is called the anxiety zone. And that is a place where mistakes happen, where deadlines are missed. It's a kind of, sometimes it can look like things are going well, but you're not hearing the full story, so things aren't going well. That's not a winning strategy. So what I call the upper right, where both are high, I call it the learning zone, but honestly, it's also the high performance zone. I mean, you need to have both. You need to have permission, not afraid of you or your colleagues, permission for candor, and a genuine commitment, an internal commitment and ownership for doing what you can.
Yeah, it's interesting. This whole issue, you can see a lot of questions and comments in the chat. This whole issue, it's very kind of activating in a way, and it also ties to many other domains. It reminds me of I went to give a keynote a few years ago at St. Jude, the cancer research hospital for kids, and they have this really unusual business model for a hospital where they at the time, it's probably changed now, but at the time they had 1,000 call center workers in a room, literally 1,000 in a giant room, like calling for dollars, right? Dialing for dollars, and in various marketing campaigns to get those numbers and get people to call in and blah blah blah. But they were raising like $100 million a year
Wow.
to cure cancer and to help kids with cancer. And they're actually, a bit of an aside, but they're actually raising these huge sums of monies to do research as well as just run the hospital, and actually doing this amazing research. And sort of the bigger the research project, the more they raised, they found it was. But the point is, like, I went in and I spent about half a day walking around, looking at the stations, talking to the nurses, the nurse managers, and just kind of getting a sense of the place. And it blew me away. Like the culture there was just amazing, because what was happening was no parents paid for anything, right? In the business model, they raised all the money, and basically, the kids were sick and the kids got treatment. But every single employee I ran into there was so accountable on so many levels, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you could explain it different ways. They were extremely engaged. They were extremely thoughtful. They're paying incredible attention. But there was this real sense of ownership. And I don't know what it was in the dynamic that sort of made that happen, but I think it was the fact that, I mean, obviously it's kids, it's cancer, it's but also just the sort of the way the business was structured. They didn't need to make money from their patients, right? The whole dynamic was about kind of serving the patient, and they took sort of the financial equation out in a way, maybe as part of that. But I think the quality of engagement and accountability I saw in those teams was really something else, compared to a hospital experience in New York, where you just feel like you need like a vacation after going in there for a couple of hours to visit someone. It's really, really different. So it's an interesting one. What are your thoughts?
Well, I'm not looking at the chat, but one of them just popped along on the horizon here, so I couldn't help seeing it from William Brown. It says, quote, "If you have to hold, with capital hold, people accountable, you've already lost." And I don't know actually who that is, but I think that's exactly right. It's sort of, the job is to get people to hold themselves accountable.
Selves
right?
accountable. That's what growth-orientated accountability
To
is.
commit. It's got to be, because fundamentally, I think one of the biggest error managers can make is not realize that your employees get to make their own decisions about what they do, right? If their decisions depend on you watching 24/7, that's just not going to work, right? So your job is to create the conditions where they make the right choices,
Right.
including the choices to exert effort and hold themselves accountable.
Right. There's so much coming up for me that, but I think that's like a definition almost of growth-oriented accountability, right? Where people leaning
It
in.
is.
They're wanting.
And you do it not because you're some kind of saint-like figure, but you do it because of your own ego, your own ambition, your own desire to help and impress your colleagues, right? So but I'll do it. I don't need a boss telling me to do it.
Yeah, it's got to be you. I remember what happened at the start of the pandemic. There was this massive bump in keystroke software being sold. So companies everywhere, I think we got to like 25% of companies suddenly had keystroke software that you could literally see how much people were typing, how much their mouse was moving and stuff. And what it resulted in was a massive, almost equally big bump in the sale of mouse jigglers. Like the mouse jiggler manufacturers had a heyday because people would buy those.
Perfect.
Like, okay.
It's a perfect illustration of perverse effects, right?
Yeah. So that's not accountability, right? Accountability, not like, and there's actually a big story, I think, the New Yorker a few years ago about this whole trend and how it was having these perverse effects, and it wasn't actually getting the results that they wanted. So that's how companies
and it's even worse than that, right? Because it ultimately, we can blame the employees for doing this, cheating thing, right? With the jiggler, but the managers have essentially created the conditions whereby that's what's going to happen, because they've created an absurd scorecard.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's one of the qualities I think that's necessary at an organizational level. There's a lot of systems work to do that, to get to this place, like the way you set goals. But just, do you have a surveillance mindset or an outcomes mindset, right, in the organization, like the sort of keystroke software? Like, are you controlling and trying to tracking, and you don't trust people? So some of those philosophical things will kind of weave into your systems, and people will sort of push back. But let me just take a slightly different direction on this for a minute. I think, and I've been thinking this for months now, and it's really becoming clearer and clearer that it's really not just accountability and psych safety. I think growth mindset is really in there together. And,
Yeah.
what we're seeing today, if a company wants to, like, cut costs as a way to grow, and they're massively focused on efficiency and cost cutting, and people following the rules and downsizing and all that, then growth mindset, psych safety, and accountability are probably not the three biggest priorities. But if a company is trying to adapt really fast, trying to grow, trying to innovate, right, trying to experiment with new markets, weaving in AI, exploring new ways of working, right, and certainly cutting costs, then growth mindset, psych safety, and accountability are probably the three pillars that people really need today. And we think that it's sort of the connection between the three of them that's really important. So we've started weaving those three into our solutions as kind of the sort of the three pillars that leaders need to really build. And accountability has to be defined correctly, that it's not punitive. The accountability piece has to be about the individual, really wanting to learn and hold themselves accountable in a way.
Well, one way I've thought about growth mindset and psychological safety, because they clearly are in the same family of they're tapping into the same phenomena, psychological phenomena. The growth mindset describes an individual orientation. Right? I have an orientation toward being willing to take risks so I can learn and grow and get better. I don't think of it, well, if I fail, that just proves I wasn't smart enough, right? So that's sort of that internal stance. Psychological safety describes the emergent property, the climate that emerges in a group, or in a work environment, and they go hand in hand, because the more the individuals have a growth mindset, the more they will likely contribute to a psychologically safe environment, because they'll be taking risks. Not everything will go well, right? So, and the more you have a psychologically safe environment, the more conducive it is to the growth mindset, because this is the kind of place where if things don't go perfectly, my colleagues aren't going to beat me up for it.
Right. Yeah, no, interesting. So, so coming back to this question, it's kind of a complex one to hold in mind, but, can you have accountability without psych safety? Can you have psych safety with accountability? Can you take us a little bit further?
I mean, I think you can have, let's say I'm the kind of person who just feels accountable for things. I want to do a good job. I just tend to be motivated. But if the job I need to do, involves periodically asking for help or raising concerns or offering dissenting views, and I quickly size up that my environment is not conducive to those kinds of interpersonal risks, then it's hard for me to exercise my sense of accountability. I'm just going to get thwarted by it. And I'm either going to leave and go do this somewhere else, or I'm just going to stop feeling as accountable.
Yeah. It's really, it's interesting. It's a lot of great questions in the chat. I see them. My team's helping distill some. There's a lot, because we've got about 800 or so people here. So we're not ignoring you. We're going to have time to get to those in a couple of minutes. But I think there's one theme that I'm seeing in the chat is this challenge of sort of what a higher order skill it is, particularly creating psych safety.
Yep.
And when you sort of bring in accountability, it's really interesting, because a lot of leaders, and I've been guilty of this myself at times, a lot of leaders will will talk about the importance of these things, but their actions are really different, right? And if they're not getting any feedback, that's really difficult, right? They're not getting accurate, honest feedback about the impact of the versus their intent. Their intent's often great, but their impact is often really different, right?
Right.
And so there's a
Right.
lack of kind of information. In our company, we just literally launched a feedback survey against our manager principals, where the entire company's, reviewing with hard metrics, the whole senior leadership team against, our values, me included. I'm looking forward to that data to see, like, how we really leading, not how do we think we're leading. So it's, in the absence of data, it's really easy for leaders to think that they're, creating psych safety and, being kind and all this, but the reality is often very, very different. So I think part of accountability is also kind of having data, having good information flowing, in all directions, so that as a leader, because that's a theme in the chat for sure. Leaders think that they're creating psych safety, but often are not.
Yeah, let me echo that and underline it, because I've been trying more and more recently to talk about psychological safety, or the creation of psychologically safe work environments, as a skill-based issue, right? That this is an higher order indeed. And I think that's probably the thing that has been most ignored or downplayed or misunderstood, which is very few, like it's the minority of managers and leaders who have the level of skill to create a learning environment. And it's just not natural. It's not often how people have been trained. And in order to do it, I think the most challenging of these higher order skills is the self-awareness, right? The self-awareness to perpetually know that you have a valid point of view and you are most certainly missing something important.
Right.
And to perpetually know that the others are bringing, important, but also potentially limited perspectives on the situation. And that's a kind of, you used the term earlier, situational humility, but it's a self-awareness, it's an emotional intelligence, it's that skill to just come in as a learner, eager to close the gaps that you absolutely know you have.
Right. Interesting. I actually think that might be a common cognitive skill across growth mindset, psych safety, and accountability. And it's this recognition that you see one slice of the world. That if you're a lawyer, you see the downsides amazingly, but you won't see the upsides so well, right? If you're a marketing person, you'll see the opportunities really well. You won't see the downside so well, right? Like a recognition that you see a slice, and the way you see the world is valid to you, but other people have also completely valid perspectives, and we need all of them. And this is I think it's a really important one. We tackle this from a brain perspective, just showing how everyone's experience is so unique. And I think if you can sort of get people to see that they will be smarter, they will lead better when they recognize that that no matter how certain they feel, they're going to be missing things, because everyone has these different filters. And I think it's a very foundational insight, that you kind of need others, because your brain only has one slice. That's common to all three.
Yes.
Are there any other skills you think are common to all three?
I think this is quite related, but curiosity, but then the skill part of curiosity is to articulate the questions in a useful way, because many questions are asked either, unwittingly as leading questions, or unnecessarily as yes/no questions, when a more open-ended version would have been better. What are you seeing? What are customers saying? Rather than, are customers liking our new product? And so the skill to pause and articulate the right questions at the right moment to yield the data that you really need. That is a skill. The skill to recognize when a conversation is sort of going sideways and know how to intervene to bring it back.
Yeah, interesting. We've got some questions just before we do. We'll come to questions in a minute, and I want to come to the DEI question in a second, and weave that in. But I just wanted to mention to folks before we get too late in, we've been thinking about this question for a while, about what are the critical habits across all of them. And for the first time in literally 26 years of our history, we think we've done enough research to be able to say, there are 9 habits that most leaders in most companies would benefit from learning.
Wow.
And we just recently, for the first time in history, opened up like an open enrollment program to be able to learn about the brain as a manager or leader. And it's a new solution called Lead. We're literally just launching it this month, The first cohort starting in a few weeks. But if my team can put it in a link in the chat, you can see there's a link just went in. So LEAD is a scalable, digital, amazing 6-month experience with actually we're calling a neuro-intelligent leadership enhancer that we've named Niles, Neuro-Intelligent Leadership Enhancer. So Niles is an AI, or as we call them, a neuro-intelligent AI. And you actually have this literally this AI that you can have a conversation with and give you all these nudges about leadership. But anyway, it's a 6-month experience. Have a look at that. And it literally has growth mindset, psych, safety, and accountability as the foundations. And we think we've worked out the critical 9 habits. We'll do a proper demo of that next week, if my team can maybe put a link in for the chat as well. But if you're from an organization and you want to kind of look at that, just put the word LEAD and your company name in the chat and someone will follow up. So LEAD, L-E-A-D, and your company name. Someone will follow up, send you some resources, get you into the demos. Yeah, just LEAD. Thanks, Kimberly, for being the first one. LEAD and your company name, and we'll follow up with some resources, invite you to the right events, etc. So anyway, that's something we've been thinking about a lot, and it's been really sort of converging on these 3 areas: growth mindset, psych, safety, and accountability. And we think there's a way to scale the teaching of this and really build habits. But let's come back to the question. So we got about a good 10 12 minutes for questions. One of them that came up sort of early, and I think it's an interesting one, is there a situation where the goals of psych safety kind of collide with the goals of diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging? Like, do you see a situation, or are they always aligned, or is there a time where they might collide?
I think the tension comes primarily from going beyond the tasks, the work tasks. But not always, right? Because sometimes the work tasks are very much about inclusion, right? So, so here the tension is, of course, that if I want people to have permission for candor, sometimes the things that they might be candid about are rather unpleasant and maybe deliberately discriminatory or exclusive ideas or behaviors. And that's where I think we're better off when we know what we're up against, than when people feel silenced or inhibited, then we don't know, it might leak, their attitudes might suggest their beliefs.
Right.
But it's I think probably the biggest tension here is that candor is hard, and it's no good without skill, right? So the very skills we were talking about before, we really need people to learn not just to speak up, but to speak up effectively, right? To speak in a way that actually has the impact, and the impact that helps the shared goal progress, right? So that's the hard part.
That's the really hard part. And I sort of take umbrage a little bit with the sort of candor work that's coming out, because I think there's this sort of belief that if people were just more honest and direct, everything would be better. And I don't see that's the case. I actually ran into a company where they mandated regular feedback, and the company ground to a halt, like it just stopped working, right? So just being more direct and more honest isn't necessarily
Yes,
how you do it.
Yeah, it's how you do it. And the problem is, I studied under Chris Argyris, who had this idea of, the left-hand column. They're the things you're thinking and feeling, but not saying. And then there's the things you're saying. And there's a disconnect, of course. And, ideally, we want those closer together. But the answer isn't just take your left-hand column information and put it over in the right. God, no, right? That would normally be rude, self-centered, egotistical. It's not the right content. So the real skill here is, how do you challenge and clean up your left-hand column and then express it productively, thoughtfully, as we used the term before. And this is, they're not actually, it is not even close to a majority of people who have the skill to do this.
Right. Yeah, no, it's really interesting. So, I mean, we think of that as challenge kindly, right? And the kindly part, you definitely can look at through the lens of SCARF, right? For people who don't know SCARF, data, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, fairness, the 5 things driving the brain toward or away. And so you're trying to challenge people, but and be candid, but you're doing it in a way that's the most helpful as you can. And so you're challenging
Right.
kindly, minimizing those scarf threats. That's kind of how we see it. And I think
You
that's
You
common.
have to want to help, right? You really do have to want to help, and you have to entertain the possibility that you don't have the whole picture and that
Yeah.
you may not be right. You may be missing something really important.
Yeah, yeah. I was just thinking about another habit that, and this addresses a couple of questions. Another habit, other than kind of aware that you only know a part of the story, right? Another habit that's very actionable that I think goes across all three is asking for feedback, and it's something we've been studying for a long time. It's a fascinating thing. We did a lab study. We actually created the conditions for people to give and receive feedback. Collected all this bio data in real time, using a real scientific lab, and amazing things we found. Receiving feedback is very stressful. We all knew that. Giving feedback turns to be as stressful or more, which was surprising, which is why people are bad at it. But it turns out when the recipient asks for feedback, it's about half as stressful for both sides. So it ends up being better. But this interesting thing happens, and I saw this in a leadership retreat I ran a few weeks ago. I had the CEO and the top 20 of the business together for a couple of days, and we ran this exercise, teaching them how to ask for feedback, and then we got them practicing. And honestly, the before and after of just the culture in this team was completely different, right? Completely different. And all that we did was we taught them to like ask well for feedback, and then receive it well, right? And there's a certain series of techniques, not that hard to learn, but really powerful. And what it did is it created a growth mindset. Because learning from others is one of the three critical pillars of growth mindset. It created psychological safety because they both got to do this. And it also created accountability. So I think that skill, and that's in lead program, that skill is, I think, across all three. Are there any others that come up for you that you think are across all three?
Yeah, I mean, you engineered psychological safety, and I love that. I mean, I think sometimes just a simple process of rounds is a kind of psychological safety creating, because in a discipline of we're going to go around, we're going to do a check-in, let's say.
Yeah.
We have people sharing something they find relevant and important to consider, and others are genuinely listening, and nobody gets hurt, and it's sort of that in that moment you've got a psychologically safe situation.
Yeah, fantastic. I've got a really fun question for you in a moment, but my team's just reminded me about something that we have a crazy growth mindset at the moment. We're experimenting like crazy with all sorts of things. So we just decided literally this week, we're going to experiment with an in-person kickoff of a lead cohort. So leaders in a cohort. And I'm personally going to deliver that in San Francisco or Silicon Valley, somewhere around there on March 20th, about a month from now. So we're going to have a day in person to kick off the 6-month journey, and in a cohort of people. So I think my team's got a link for that in the chat. We'll also send that out to folks. But we're experimenting literally just this week. Like, why don't we try this, see if people like the idea? So we're going to have a day in person. I'm leading that to kick off this 6-month journey. And this journey like literally has all the critical habits you need to lead people from a brain perspective better. But let me go back to, I think, the most fun question of all, and most challenging, and maybe the most important and the most fun. And that is, Amy, what would you say to a CEO? Like, give us the words, give us the pitch. What would you say to a CEO who says, we don't need this psych safety stuff anymore. We need to focus on accountability. What are you going to say to them?
Say, gosh, I wish that were the case. Here's the worry I have about that. There is a great deal of uncertainty in your business environment today. And without psychological safety, you are at risk of not hearing about the things that are really happening. People in teams are at risk of being unable to do the experiments they need to do in order for you to succeed, not just today, but even more importantly, over the long term. And here's why, right? So I kind of connect the dots between why psychological safety is mission critical to performing well in an uncertain world.
Right.
Not, you just simply cannot, you can't wish away reality.
Right. Right. And it's not just kindness and empathy. It actually requires clarity about outcomes.
Right.
So you can't really have it without clarity about outcomes. So it's not devoid of accountability. You actually need accountability.
You need accountability. It's the primary thing that even if you say that out loud, Mr. or Ms. CEO, and or if you're just thinking it, you will not succeed in creating a sort of culture of magnificent, accountable execution, you will largely succeed in a culture of things going underground, right?
Yeah.
People just not really speaking the truth to each other and or not taking the risks they need to take to succeed over the long term.
Yeah, people just going to ground. Yeah. So, as we close, all our work, we think of three things you've got to do. Make something a priority, build habits, put in place systems, right? You need both priorities, habits, and systems. And I think, this kind of culture change in an organization is very, very possible, but it does require like people literally building new habits. And, we've been thinking deeply about the kinds of habits here. And this has been super helpful, Amy, to help for everyone, but myself especially, I'm sure, to like really understand each of them and how they connect. I expect we're going to continue this conversation in writing and put some things out. But I think the reality is you can't have proper psych safety without accountability, without people feeling like they want to get better, that they want to learn, that they know what's expected of them. If people don't know what's expected of them and they're not kind of leaning in and psychologically owning something, it's very hard to have for these other two to exist. So thank you so much for being here today. Any closing comments before we wrap up?
Well, I think I'll just, since you brought up the lead, I'll bring up teams again, because I think, one of the things that was most satisfying for me last year was to sort of to come to you with my, inductive research-based ideas and have you and your team try to figure out where the neuroscience would suggest something different. And ultimately, after massive sort of debate and exploration, we arrived at a place where, wow, the neuroscience actually backs this stuff up. And then we developed materials to make it scalable for your teams. So I think it's really, it was an experience for me that was very satisfying, and I'm very proud of the product.
It's actually getting some incredible results out there. So it's set the stage, invite participation, respond thoughtfully over a month, and you can scale that to the entire company. Folks, just put the word team in the chat if you're interested in learning more about team. Put the word team in the chat, and someone will follow up with you with resources and more information. We might do a demo on team in the next couple of weeks, a product demo, so we can really bring that alive. So yeah, there you go. The chat's blowing up there. So team is a 30-day experience you can do completely digitally or virtually or in person, all sorts of ways. But you can scale that to any size audience in just literally 30 days and actually get better results than doing it all in workshops. You can do it digitally. So thanks for the reminder there, Amy. So fantastic conversation. I'm really energized by the connections between these things. My brain's buzzing with all the more research we want to do. I think just, Amy, thank you so much for your participation today, for your thoughtful comments, and wish you well with all your research. And to everyone else, I'll let you jump off there, Amy. I'll just do a quick closing comments.
Great. Thank you
very much. Take care of
All the
yourself.
best.
Look after each other. Thanks. And I'm going to hand back. Shelby, you have any closing comments? I'm going to hand back to you. Thank you so much for an amazing session today. So many insights. I'll jump off there and hand back to you for some closing comments. Thanks so much. Take care.
Awesome. Thanks, David. Again, thank you. And thank you, Amy. That was such a fantastic conversation with a ton of insights. Now for closing, let us know how we can help you. We're going to share our poll, so please engage with that. Just a few quick things. If you weren't able to join us at this year's summit, we do still have on-demand passes, and you could see a panel where David and Amy also had a similar conversation, along with a lot of other great sessions. So if you're interested in that, we can share the link in the chat. And if you enjoyed today's conversation, you'll love the podcast. As David mentioned, there are some episodes from previous guests and a ton of information on there too. So look for Your Brain at Work live wherever you listen to your podcast. And this is where we officially say farewell. So on behalf of our team behind the scenes, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate you taking the time to join us every Friday, and we'll see you back here next week. Have a wonderful day.